For 900 years, the Galactic Sovereignty Council had been deciding the fates of lesser civilizations. It did so well, efficiently. The meeting hall itself was designed to make guests feel insignificant. The stone floors were carved from a dead moon. The walls were hewn from the hull of a generation ship that had drifted for 2,000 years before it ran out of energy and people. The council salvaged the hull and built their chamber inside it, a reminder that the galaxy didn't care how hard you tried. The galaxy cared about one thing. Were you strong enough to survive? Humanity was not strong enough. That conclusion lay on the table when High Councilor Dreven opened the session. Dreven was a T. His species possessed 3 eyes, arranged in a triangle on a flat, gray face, and the central eye never blinked. It observed everything. He had observed the human species for 11 years, ever since the first human scout ship had clumsily stumbled through the Grape Corridor and nearly collided with a VH patrol cruiser. Humans apologized quite fervently. They sent a follow-up message with a gift basket. No one on the council knew what to do with a gift basket. 11 years since first contact, and the picture of humanity was clear. They were small. Their fleet numbered about 400 ships, which by any standard was modest. Their weapon technology lagged behind the council members by at least 60 years. In their home system, they had 1 inhabited planet and 2 mining stations that looked like they had been assembled by people who had never seen blueprints. Their soldiers were soft-bodied creatures, sensitive to temperature, who needed pressurized suits just to walk through space. But they had found the Grape Corridor, mapped it, and used it to quietly push their borders 7 sectors closer to council space over the decades. That was the problem. Not the ships, not the weapons, but the advancement, the quiet, steady, joyful advancement, like someone who hadn't been told where the walls were. Councilor Marin and the Sket Leos spoke up. The Sket were thin, insectoid creatures with a talent for trade law and a deep ancestral memory of being conquered. They didn't like being near new civilizations that were expanding. "The proposal has been on the table for 3 weeks," she said. "We have the votes. Let's just proceed." Dreven looked at his notes. The records were mostly ceremonial. He had already made his decision. The proposal was to deliver a formal border declaration to the human species, make it clear that their expansion into Sector 141 was no longer acceptable, and demand they retreat to their original borders. He paused. "And send a fleet to make that announcement credible." "How large a fleet?" asked Councilor Bren of the Hala. The Hala were broad, stone-skinned beings who communicated mostly through posture. Bren's posture suggested he thought this was unnecessary. "But I will not argue." 300 ships, Dreven said. "Combat-ready, positioned at the edge of their outer system. They will see them on their sensors before the message even arrives." Silence. Then, Marin said, "Isn't that excessive for 400 ships and 2 mining stations?" Dreven closed his records. "It isn't about their ships, it's about the lesson. A species learns who it is. In the first instance, you do not get a second chance to create a first impression." The vote passed 29-3. Assembling the fleet at the edge of human space took 6 weeks. 300 ships from 9-member species. Cruisers the size of small moons. Carriers loaded with fighters. Electronic warfare ships capable of blinding a star system's communications in under 4 minutes. Dreven himself traveled aboard the flagship, the Asterisk of Eternal Witness, a vote dreadnought that had participated in 4 major wars and had never lost one. They exited hyperspace at 600 hours standard council time, exactly 11 light minutes from Earth. Dreven stood on the bridge and looked at the display screen. There was Earth, blue and white, looking very small. There were the 2 mining stations, exactly where the report said they would be, drifting in lazy orbits around the outer planet they called Saturn. There were a few human ships, the scanner said, performing routine patrols of the system, and nothing more. "Send the message," Dreven said. The message went out on all standard frequencies in 17 languages, including 3 human ones. It was polite. It was formal. It was also very clear. The council fleet would remain at the edge of the system for 48 hours. During that time, a response was expected from the human government, confirming they accepted the border terms. If no confirmation was received, the fleet would advance for enforcement. Then they waited. The response came in 9 hours. Not a surrender, not an agreement, but a request for a meeting. The human government, something called the United Earth Assembly, expressed immense respect for the Galactic Sovereignty Council. They were very sorry for any misunderstanding regarding the border sectors. They were happy to discuss the matter in detail. They were sending a representative, 1 ship, Lieutenant Commander Oris, a VA communications officer, read the message 3 times before bringing it to Dreven. "One ship, sir. They call it their diplomatic vessel." Dreven looked at the message. "One ship. Yes. We sent 300. Yes." Dreven paused. He remembered the gift basket from 11 years ago. He remembered the joyful apologies of the scout crew. He remembered how humanity had spent a decade quietly expanding, never seeming to notice that expansion without permission was something that caused civilizations to be removed from the galaxy's guest list. "Fine," he said. "We accept them. One ship. We will give them their meaning. We will lay out the terms in person. Sometimes a species needs to see the numbers on the screen and the ships out the window simultaneously before the math becomes a reality for them." He didn't think it would be difficult. The ship arrived 17 hours later. It moved slowly, standard for a diplomatic approach, a signal that you were not preparing to attack. It followed proper council protocol for requesting approach clearance, broadcasting AF codes on the correct frequencies, maintaining a safe distance from the fleet's outer perimeter until it was cleared. Everything correct, everything by the book. Dreven watched it on the main display as it entered the view of the asterisk of Eternal Witness's forward cameras. It wasn't a large ship, about 400 meters long, roughly a quarter the size of the asterisk. Long and angular, which gave Dreven the impression of something built for speed, not comfort. The hull was dark gray, almost black. There were no visible weapon ports on the exterior. What he noted, either it was unarmed, or the weapons were internal or recessed, which was a more sophisticated design choice than he expected. On the hull, in large white letters, was the name Retribution. 4, said Oris. Interstellar designation for their ship class and name. Oris checked. Retribution. In the human language, it means the calculation of consequences or the moment when debts are paid. Dreven looked at the name. They named their diplomatic ship that. "It seems so, sir," he said. He decided not to attach too much meaning to the name. Species named their ships strangely. The UKED had a diplomatic cruiser called Asterisk. Beautiful morning. Names meant nothing. "Contact them," he said. The face that appeared on the screen was human, female, dark-skinned, short hair, dressed in what looked more like a military uniform than a diplomatic gown, which Dreven noted. She had a face that was very calm, not cold, just calm, like someone who had learned not to show their calculations. "Hi, Councilor Dreven," she said. Her pronunciation of his name was good, better than most alien species. "I am Admiral Voss of the United Earth Assembly. I represent our government on this matter. Thank you for agreeing to the meeting." "Admiral," Dreven said. "I note your title. We requested a diplomatic representative." "I am also that," Voss said. She smiled. It was a small, patient smile. "We decided that, given the nature of your visit, it would be more appropriate to send someone familiar with the military component of the conversation." "We are not here for a military conversation," Dreven said. "We are here to deliver a border declaration and receive your government's confirmation of its terms." "Of course," Voss said. The smile didn't change. "We fully understand. We would like to discuss the terms in some detail. If you are ready, we have a few questions." Dreven agreed. He expected this. Species always asked questions when they first encountered the authority of the Council. They haggled, they asked for modifications, they offered counter-proposals, and then, eventually, they accepted. Because the alternative was what sat 11 light minutes from their home world. "You may come aboard the Asterisk of Eternal Witness," he said. "We will meet in the reception hall." "Actually," Voss said, "we would prefer that you come to us." Another pause, another small smile. "We have drinks." Dreven almost refused. Coming aboard the flagship was standard. Coming aboard a smaller vessel on unknown territory was not. But then he thought again about the lesson, about the math of 300 ships against one, about how it would look. 300 against one. And the 300 were afraid to board the one? "Agreed," he said. A shuttle from the Asterisk docked with the Retribution. 40 minutes later, Dreven brought 12 staff members, security advisors, his translator, and specialists. He walked through the docking tunnel onto the human ship, and his first impression was warmth. The corridor was warmer than the Council standard. The lighting was also a bit warmer, a yellowish tint instead of the cold white of the Vote ships. It smelled of something for which he had no word. A human crew member met them at the docking ring. A young man with an open face and the easy posture of someone who wasn't nervous. "Hi, Counselor. Welcome aboard the Retribution. I am Lieutenant Chen. I will lead you to the Admiral." The corridors were clean and well-maintained. The crew they passed, about a dozen humans visible in the passageways, acknowledged the group of visitors with polite nods and returned to their work. No intense staring, no obvious alarm. Dreven's security officer, Intini Tovel, stepped next to him and whispered, "They are afraid." "No," Dreven said. "They should be." He didn't respond to that. The meeting hall was in the center of the ship. A long table, chairs on either side, a viewport at one end showing the stars. At each seat, cups of something hot were waiting. Admiral Voss was already standing when they entered. She shook Dreven's hand. Humans did that. He had read about it. The physical contact was still slightly shocking. Vought did not touch strangers unnecessarily, but he completed the gesture. "Please sit," she said. "The drink is called coffee. You don't have to try it, but it's there." They sat. Dreven looked around the room. The walls were not bare. They had things attached to them. Objects. A framed photograph depicting what looked like a large gathering of people in a wide open space, a flat piece of metal with text that Dreven's translator couldn't immediately decipher. And in the corner, something that looked like a piece of hull plating from another ship, riddled with what looked like weapon marks, mounted as a trophy on a small bracket. Dreven glanced at the latter for a moment. Voss followed his gaze. "A piece of a Kret raider," she said casually. "They tried to capture our first colonial ship about 30 years ago. Before we had real combat ships, we managed." "With what?" Dreven asked, before he could decide whether he should ask. Voss smiled again. That same patient, quiet smile. "Mining equipment on board," she said. "Creative application." Dreven looked at his notes. The Kret were not council members, but they were a known species with real combat capabilities. A colonial ship with mining equipment shouldn't have been able to. "Let's begin," Voss said. Dreven pushed the hull plate out of his head. This was a border meeting. 300 ships. 1. The math was clear. He opened the declaration document on his tablet and turned it toward her. She looked at it. She read it carefully from beginning to end without saying a word. Her facial expression did not change. When she finished, she folded her hands on the table and looked at Dreven across the space between them. "Those are interesting terms," she said. "They are the Council's terms." "Yes." She tilted her head slightly. "May I ask? I want to be sure that I am asking sincerely, not as a negotiating position. May I ask? Why do you believe we will accept them?" Dreven blinked slowly with his central eye. It was a T gesture, meaning he was choosing his words. "Because you are a small, new civilization. And the Council—" "No." "Exactly," Voss said. "That is true." She looked at the document again. "But you didn't ask us what we brought." The room was quiet. Dreven looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You sent 300 ships," she said. "We sent 1. I am sure that seems like a very clear statement of the situation." She paused. "We thought about it the same way. In fact, we discussed sending more ships, a fleet, to match your numbers, to make the scene feel more balanced. Why didn't you?" "Because 1 ship," Voss said, and the smile was still there, patient and small, and hadn't gone anywhere, seemed like enough. Dreven's central eye did not blink. Outside the viewport, 300 warships stood in perfect formation against the backdrop of the dark cosmos. And somewhere deep in the recesses of Dreven's mind, a very quiet, very ancient instinct, the instinct of something that had survived long enough to pass its caution down through 900 years of council history, said, "Ask her what is on the ship." He did not ask. Not yet. But he thought about the hull plate on the wall, about the mining equipment, and the name written on the board in white letters that meant the moment when debts were paid. He thought about the crew that wasn't afraid. And for the first time since the fleet jumped into position 11 light minutes from Earth, High Councilor Dreven felt something he hadn't expected to feel in this room. He felt curiosity which, as he later reflected, was the first sign that he had already lost control of the meeting. The coffee, by any reasonable measure, was a terrible drink. Dreven tasted it because refusing would have seemed like a small loss of position, and he wasn't in the habit of losing position in any form. It was bitter. It was hot in a way that hit the back of his throat like a slight insult. It had a burnt smell that seemed to calm the humans in the room. Judging by the way they leaned over their cups before drinking, he put the cup down and returned to the document. "The term is not a proposal," he said. "I want to be clear about this. This is not a starting point for negotiations. The Council does not negotiate border declarations with species classified below Level 4. "What is a Level 4? Admiral Voss asked. She seemed genuinely curious. "It is a classification of a civilization at an early stage of expansion. Younger than 100 years of interstellar travel, limited fleet capabilities, no membership in the Council. She nodded slowly. And what level are the Council member species? Level 1. The Great Gap. Yes. She looked at the document again. She had been looking at it intermittently for the last 40 minutes, which was more time than anyone had ever given a border declaration in all of Dreven's experience. Usually, by this point, a representative of a smaller species was either crying, haggling, or already signing. Voss was doing none of those. She was reading the document with the focused attention of a person looking for something specific and not yet finding it. Dreven's advisor, a sket named Pell, leaned toward his ear. "She is stalling," Pell whispered. "I know," Dreven said. "We should press." "I know," he said again. He looked at Voss across the table. "Admiral, I understand this is not easy news, but the fleet outside your system is not a negotiating tool, it is a fact. Every hour we spend in this room is an hour your government spends looking at 300 warships on their long-range sensors. I do not think prolonging this experience is in the interest of your people." Voss looked up from the document. "You are probably right," she said. "May I ask you something personal?" He hadn't expected that. "What?" "How many such meetings have you conducted? Border declarations, new species like these?" Dreven straightened slightly. "This is my 14th. I am the 14th. She seemed to think about that. "And all 14 accepted the terms?" "All 14 accepted the terms." "How long did the longest take?" He remembered. 6 hours. The Marin Collective. They were quite stubborn, and in the end, they accepted. In the end, they accepted. Voss nodded. She took her coffee cup, sipped slowly, and set it back down. "I want you to know," she said. "I sincerely respect the Council's position. 14 out of 14 is a strong record. You clearly know what you are doing." She paused. "I also want you to know that we are not the Marin Collective. No species is another species." "That is a fair point," she smiled. "I will need more time to study the terms with my government before I can give you an official answer." Dreven looked at her. "How much time?" 24 hours. The number fell on the table. Pell stirred in his seat. Dreven kept a calm face, because showing irritation in front of a level 4 representative would be undignified. And dignity was one of the few currencies that never lost value. 12 hours, he said. Voss considered this. 18. "This is not a negotiation." "You are right. This is a scheduled discussion." The smile was patient again, unhurried. 18 hours. "I will have an official answer from my government. If they agree to the terms, I will sign the document. If they have questions, I will pass them on. And if they refuse?" She looked at him with those very calm eyes. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." Dreven agreed to 18 hours because the alternative was the immediate advancement of the fleet before a response was received, which would look like aggression rather than enforcement. And the Council cared about how it looked. 900 years of careful reputation management had taught them that. He stood up. His staff stood up with him. Voss stood up too and extended her hand again, and he shook it again. Her grip was firm, not threatening, but not soft. "Lieutenant Chen will escort you back to your shuttle," she said. "Thank you for coming aboard, High Councilor." When Dreven turned to leave, he glanced one more time at the hull plate attached to the wall. Kret Raider, mining equipment. He wanted to ask more about it. He decided instead to look it up in the records. Tovel had questions. Dreven's security officer was waiting for him at the docking ring when the group returned to the shuttle, which meant he had left the meeting hall earlier, which meant something had distracted him. Dreven raised an eyebrow as Tovel stepped next to him. "The ship," Tovel said quietly. "What about it?" "I took a walk while you were at the meeting. Lieutenant Chen escorted me, showed the ship very nicely." And Tovel paused for a few seconds as they boarded the shuttle and closed the hatch behind the last staff member. Then he said, "The corridors don't match." Dreven looked at him. "Explain." "I counted steps. I walked the corridors, estimated the sizes. The ship is about 400 meters long on the outside. A standard layout for a vessel of that size would give you perhaps 40% of usable internal volume when you account for engines, fuel, storage, and hull thickness." He pointed to a part of his sketch. "But the corridors I walk don't match that. The usable space is larger by a significant amount." Dreven studied the sketch. "Maybe you miscalculated?" "I do not miscalculate." The shuttle undocked. Through a small viewport, Dreven caught a final glimpse of the hull of the asterisk of Retribution as they drifted away. Long, angular, dark gray, almost black. "What is your conclusion?" Dreven asked. "Either the hull is much thinner than it looks, which would make it extremely fragile, which does not match the behavior of the crew, Or there are sections of this ship hidden from the walking tour. Dreven thought about this, the entire shuttle ride back to the asterisk of eternal witness. He thought about it while he changed out of his diplomatic clothes back into his uniform. He thought about it while he ate. He thought about it at 200 hours, when he was still awake and the rest of the ship was running on a skeleton crew and the stars outside his window didn't move. Then he went to the bridge and found his sensor officer. Commander Yed was a young Vought officer who had graduated top of her class at the Council Military Institute and possessed a talent for reading sensor data bordering on the supernatural. She wasn't asleep when Dreven arrived on the bridge, which spoke of her habits. "The human ship," Dreven said without preamble. "What do our sensors say about it?" Yed pulled the data onto her console. "Standard long-range scans, sir. We have been conducting passive monitoring since they docked. Show me the energy signature." She pulled up a graph. Power output of the Retribution over time, a line that should have been relatively flat, showing normal operation, normal power consumption for life support, navigation, communications. Dreven looked at the line. It wasn't flat. It was regular, not dramatic, but it spiked sharply. The peaks weren't huge, but they were consistent. Every 40 to 60 minutes, the ship's energy consumption spiked sharply for about 90 seconds, then returned to the baseline. "What is that?" Dreven asked. "Unknown," Yed said. "Our best guess, a charging cycle. Some kind of capacitor system pulling and storing energy? Charging for what?" "Unknown. Possibly an unknown weapon, but the frequency doesn't match any weapon system in our database. It is also too slow for a weapon readiness cycle. Most weapons charge in seconds or minutes. 4-0-minute intervals suggest something large, or something requiring a very high total energy reserve before it can operate." Dreven stared at the graph. The peaks were small, patient, regular, like breathing. "How long has this cycle been running?" Yed checked. "About 2 hours after the ship entered our perimeter, sir, which meant it began the cycle even before the meeting began." "Can you tell how much energy has been stored?" "Not precisely, but if the cycle has been running for 18 hours at the current consumption," she quickly calculated on a secondary screen. "A significant amount, sir. More than a ship of that class needs for any standard operation." Dreven looked out the viewport at the human ship, quietly sitting in the dark, 3 kilometers off the starboard bow of the asterisk of eternal witness. One ship, 400 meters, dark gray hull, almost black. He thought about the crew that wasn't afraid. "Continue monitoring," he said. "I want to know the moment anything in that energy signature changes." "Yes, sir." Yed paused. "Sir, do you want me to initiate a more aggressive scan? We could get better data with an active sensor scan. They would know we are scanning, almost certainly." Dreven thought about it. Aggressive scanning during a diplomatic pause was technically a provocation. It said, "We don't trust you," which they didn't, but saying it aloud or on sensor frequencies changed the nature of the encounter. "Not yet," he said. He returned to his quarters. He didn't sleep. He lay on his bunk in the dark and thought about the 14 meetings and the 14 acceptances, and the Marin Collective that lasted 6 hours and eventually signed, because 6 hours was nothing compared to the weight of 300 ships. He thought about Voss, who asked for 18 hours. He thought about what she said, "We are not the Marin Collective." And he thought about what she didn't say, namely, "We are afraid," because she didn't say it, nor did any of her crew. No human on that ship in all the corridors, meeting halls, and docking airlocks looked afraid. Dreven had conducted 14 such meetings. He knew what fear looked like. He knew what a species looked like when the math of a situation settled in on it. He knew the specific quality of silence that descended upon a room when a representative of a lesser civilization finally realized that the choice wasn't between good outcomes. It was a choice between bad outcomes and very bad outcomes. Voss didn't have that silence. Voss served coffee, talked about schedules, and smiled. At 800 hours, Lieutenant Chen sent a polite message to the asterisk of eternal witness, informing them that Admiral Voss was ready to resume negotiations whenever the High Counselor wished. Dreven went. This time he brought Tovel and Yed and told them both to pay attention to everything, not the conversation, everything else, the walls, the sounds, the equipment, the crew, everything that wasn't the conversation. The meeting hall on the asterisk of Retribution looked the same. Voss was at the table. When he entered, there was a fresh cup of coffee in front of her. With her, this time, were 2 other humans. A man with short, graying hair, introduced as the Admiral's senior tactical officer, Commander Hale, and a young woman with dark eyes and an expression of polite patience, introduced simply as Dr. Park, the ship's chief science officer. Dreven sat, his staff sat. The hull plate was still on the wall. "You have had time to consult with your government," he said. "What is the Assembly's position?" "The Assembly has several questions," Voss said. Dreven inhaled, exhaled. "As I said yesterday, this is not a negotiation. And as I said, these are questions." She folded her hands on the table. "The declaration requires us to exit sectors 14 through 21. That is 7 sectors. We have had active operations in those sectors for 6 years. Civilian settlements, research outposts, families." She said the word carefully, not dramatically, just placed it there. Families. "The declaration gives us 30 days to complete the withdrawal." "That is correct." "What happens to the settlements in those 30 days?" "They are protected under Council supervision. They are considered human territory until the deadline expires. And after the deadline, they are considered unauthorized occupation of Council-governed space, which means," Dreven looked at her, "that the Council will take enforcement action regarding the border." Voss nodded slowly. "I see." She glanced at the document. "And the research outposts? We have 11 active research stations in those sectors. One of them is a joint project with the Hala. Our researchers from the Hala also require withdrawal." Dreven looked at his advisor, Pell, who checked his notes. "Joint projects do not grant exceptions," Pell said quietly, "meaning our Hala colleagues will also have to leave by the deadline." Voss seemed to think about this. She turned to Dr. Park and said something in a quiet voice that Dreven's translator picked up as a fragment, something about numbers and surface area calculations. Park replied just as quietly. Then Voss looked at Dreven again. "Hi, Counselor," she said. "I want to ask you something, and I appreciate an honest answer." "I am always honest. Is there any version of this meeting in which we do not sign the declaration?" The room was quiet. "No," Dreven said. "No." "That is what I thought." She took her coffee, sipped slowly, and set it back down. "Then I would like to ask you something else." She looked at him, and for the first time, the smile changed. It didn't disappear. It became smaller, quieter, and somehow firmer, like a fire becomes smaller but hotter when it is squeezed. "How much do you know," she said, "about what this ship actually is?" The room was very quiet. Tovel, standing against the wall behind Dreven, froze in that specific state in which well-trained security officers freeze when something changes. "This is a diplomatic ship," Dreven said. "It is also that," Voss said. "Yes." She glanced at Commander Hale, who watched the table with the neutral expression of a person who had heard this part of the conversation before. Then she looked at Dreven again. "When the Assembly decided to respond to your fleet, we held a discussion on what to send. The options were complex. You chose one ship. We chose this ship." The distinction was subtle but clear in how she said it. Not a ship, but this one. Dreven looked at her, at the hull plate on the wall, at Hale's neutral face, at Park's dark, patient eyes. "Why?" he asked. "Because one was enough," she said, "and because more than that." She paused. She tilted her head slightly, and the small, hot smile sat on her face like something she had stopped trying to hide. "We wanted to be polite about it. We wanted to give your council the opportunity to reconsider before this became a conversation of a different kind. The Eternal Witness was 3 kilometers away. 300 ships were 11 light minutes from Earth." Dreven looked at the woman across the table who asked for 18 hours and served coffee and talked about schedules and small, patient smiles, and the old instinct in the depths of his mind, the one that had quietly worked for 900 years, keeping caution, said, "Ask her what is on the ship." This time he asked. "Admiral Voss," he said, "what is on the ship?" She looked at him for a moment. Then very simply she said, "Everything we needed." Outside the viewport, the stars were motionless. The Retribution sat quietly in the dark. Its energy cycled in those small, patient, regular peaks, charging something in its belly that was not in the Council's database. And in that moment, Dreven understood not fully, not yet, but enough that the math of 300 to 1 had never been the correct math. He just didn't know what the correct math was. Dreven summoned his flag officers at 1,100 hours in the war room of the Asterisk of Eternal Witness. There were 9 of them, 1 from each member species currently represented in the fleet. They sat around a circular table under light that was intentionally colder and harsher than the rest of the ship, because the Council had long ago decided that a room where difficult decisions were made should feel like a difficult room. No warmth, no comfort, only clarity. Dreven told them what Tovel had found, what Yed had found, what Voss had said. The room went silent for a moment when he finished. Then Fleet Admiral Brask of the Hala, the largest and oldest officer in the room, shifted his broad body and said, "She told you that one ship was enough. That is not a hint. It is a statement." Brask's posture said something more than his words. The specific angle of his shoulders roughly translated to, "I have heard this tone before, and I did not like where it led. You said she wasn't afraid." "In my experience," Brask said, "there are two types of species that encounter a superior force without showing fear, those who don't yet understand what they are facing." "And the other type?" asked Admiral Safe of the K, a narrow, fast-moving species that commanded most of the Council's light combat aviation. Brask looked at the table. "Those who have a different silence." Dreven looked at his officers. He thought about what he knew. "Option 1, he said. "We advance the fleet. We surround the asterisk of Retribution and inform Admiral Voss that the time for discussion has passed. We give her 1 hour to transmit her government's agreement. If she does not, we will consider the ship an enemy vessel and act accordingly." "Act accordingly meaning?" asked Safe. "Minimally, disable it. We are not here to start a war. We are here to enforce the border declaration." "Option 2, Brask said. "We retreat. We return to Council space. We postpone this matter and return to it with more information." The room didn't have to discuss Option 2 for long. Retreating without a signed declaration was not a neutral action. It was a concession. 900 years of consistent enforcement, 14 out of 14. And for the 15th time, the Council retreated without a signature, because one diplomatic ship charged its power system and said something vague about having enough of everything it needed. The Council's credibility was the only thing holding the coalition together. Without it, Option 2 did not lead to a safer result. It led to a slower, messier version of the same problem. "Option 1, Dreven said. "Unanimous agreement." It wasn't entirely unanimous. Brask voted yes, but his posture said something about the weight of that yes that Dreven chose not to translate directly. The fleet began moving at 1,300 hours. Not all 300 ships. That would be excessive, even for the Council. Dreven ordered a forward group 60 ships to advance from the outer perimeter to the position of the asterisk of Retribution. 60 was still a number that conveyed everything that needed to be conveyed. 60 warships tightening the circle around 1400. Meter diplomatic vessel was not an ambiguous gesture. The Retribution didn't move. Dreven expected some reaction, a grumble of retreat to a safer distance, a quick communication from Voss, something to show that the situation had been recalibrated. The Retribution sat exactly where it had sat since its arrival. Its running lights were on. Its communication array was active. By all sensor readings, it was doing nothing. "Contact them," Dreven said. Voss appeared on the screen within seconds. This time she wasn't sitting at the table. She was on her bridge, standing with Hale and Park nearby, and the rest of her crew at their stations. The bridge of the asterisk of Retribution looked functional, that was the word for it. Not impressive, not luxurious. Clean lines, muted colors. The people sat at their stations with the focused attention of people who weren't looking at the 60 ships closing in around them, but at their own screens, their own readings, their own instruments. "High Councilor," Voss said. "I expected your call." "The fleet is advancing," Dreven said. "I want to give you one last opportunity to transmit your government's agreement before this situation changes in a way that will be difficult to reverse." "I appreciate that," Voss said. "I truly do." She paused. "I have a question for you first, Admiral. One question. Then I will allow you to do what you are going to do." She looked at him with that calm, level, patient grumble she had been showing since she first appeared on his communication screen. "How much do you know about human history?" Dreven didn't answer immediately. "Not about political history," she said. "Not about exploration history. I mean the older part, the one from before we left our planet." She glanced towards something off-screen, then back. "Because there is something about us that I think is relevant to this conversation, and I want to be fair to you before we proceed. Admiral of the fleet, we have fought through most of our history," she said. Not loudly, not dramatically, as if stating a fact that everyone in the room already knew but hadn't yet voiced. Continuous war, thousands of years. Tribes, then kingdoms, then nations, then coalitions. We fought for land, for water, for belief systems, for lines on maps that didn't even exist. We developed weapons against ourselves. We used them against ourselves. She paused again, and we survived all of it. And then we took everything we learned from thousands of years of inflicting pain on each other and applied it to engineering. The 60 ships were now 3 light seconds away. Dreven watched the distance close on his secondary screen while Voss spoke. "I am telling you this not to threaten you," she said. "I am telling you this because I think this is information you deserve to know before you give your next order." She looked directly into the camera with those calm eyes and said, "Are you sure? Transmit your government's agreement," Dreven said, "or stand by for enforcement actions." Voss held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "Okay," and closed the channel. No weapons. That was the first thing Dreven noticed, and the most confusing. When the Retribution finally moved, the ship didn't activate weapons. It didn't raise shields, it didn't try to retreat. It slowly, almost lazily, turned, rotating on its long axis until its nose was pointed not at the approaching fleet, but at a point in empty space, approximately at a 4-3-degree angle to the fleet's port. "What is it targeting?" Dreven asked. "Nothing," Yed said. "There is nothing in that direction. Empty space." Then what? The energy signature jumped, not one of the small, regular 4-0-minute spikes. Something different. A massive, singular discharge. A full system jump that lit up the sensor console like a power grid failure. For about 4 seconds, the Retribution consumed so much energy through its systems that only thermal glow was visible on their thermal sensors from a distance of 3 kilometers. Then it stopped. Nothing happened. No explosion, no beam, no projectile. The forward group of 60 ships continued the advance without incident. Their weapons were charged and targeted, and the Retribution stood right there, and nothing happened. "Report," Dreven said. "No incoming fire," Yed said. No active weapon signatures from the human ship. The energy surge had stopped. She stared at her screen. "Sir, I am receiving an anomalous reading in the space the human ship was pointing at." Define anomalous. Space is distorted. Something changed the local geometry of space-time in an area of approximately 200 kilometers in diameter in that direction. She looked up from her console, and her expression was that of a person reporting a fact he had not yet processed emotionally. "Sir, did they put something there? I have none of this on any scan. No mass readings, no M signatures, no thermal output. But the geometry of space says there is something there." Dreven stared at the display. Empty space with something in it that didn't show up on any instrument, except for the fact that the very space around it was distorted. "Open a channel to the other flag officers," he said. "I want." "Sir," Tovel was at his shoulder. "The asterisk of Retribution is transmitting, not to the asterisk of Eternal Witness, not via standard communication channels. A narrow beam signal, heavily encrypted, aimed at Earth, aimed at home." Dreven looked at the signal data on Yed's board and thought, "She is not asking for instructions, she already has them. She is telling them the time has come." The 60 ships were at 1 light second. "Halt the advance," Dreven said. The order was executed. The 60 ships slowed and took up position in a wide arc around the asterisk of Retribution. The human ship sat inside this arc like something feeling comfortable in a cage it had built itself. "Contact them again," Dreven said. No answer. He tried twice more. "Nothing, sir," Yed said. "The energy is cycling again. Not that big surge. The small 4-0-minute charges are back, patient, regular, already climbing to the level they were at before the discharge." Everything she had just placed in that empty spot of space had cost her 1 charge. Now she was building the next one. Dreven looked at the display, at the asterisk of Retribution, at the spot of warped space. It was aimed at his 60 ships, frozen in standby mode. They hadn't expected to be waiting. "Commander Yed," he said. "Can you tell what the anomalous region contains?" "No, sir. No conventional signature trace. It is as if the object or objects in that region were designed not to return sensor data." "Can you tell how big the area is?" 200 kilometers in diameter, as I said." "But, sir," she looked at her readings again, "I think the region is slowly expanding, barely measurable. But yes, warped space. An invisible something is growing outward at a speed that will take days to matter at the current rate." Days. Dreven thought about the Retribution and its crew, who weren't afraid. He thought about Voss explaining thousands of years of war, laid out quietly like a woman laying out a fact she hoped you would pick up. He thought about the energy surge, the narrow beam transmission to Earth, the constantly cycling battery restoring itself in the belly of a ship that still stood calmly inside a ring of 60 warships, not trying to escape. He looked at his security officer, Tovel. "Sir, how many charges do you think it can accumulate?" Tovel looked at the sensor data, at the elapsed time, at the recharge speed. He performed the calculations so that Dreven could see, without even looking at the small change in posture, that the numbers were not good. At the current recharge speed, Tovel said, it will reach a full charge again in about 42 minutes, and then it will place another one. Dreven pointed to the display. Another one of these, presumably. And if we destroy the ship right now, before it can fire again? Tovel paused. The first one is already there, sir, expanding. We don't know what it is, and we can't scan it, and we don't know how to stop it because we don't know what it's doing. He paused. Destroying the Retribution now would only stop the second one. The first one is already in play. Dreven looked at the expanding invisible region in space. He thought about the 60 ships, 240 ships still at the outer perimeter, Earth and its tiny fleet of 400 patrol ships. He thought about the math he had been so sure of when he arrived. 300 to 1. He thought about the wrong number all this time. The correct number wasn't 300, or 1, or even the 18 hours Voss had asked for. The correct number was 42 minutes. That was how much time the Council had to decide what to do before the Retribution deployed its second invisible, unscannable, expanding object in the space between his fleet and home. And the Retribution just sat there, with running lights on, crew at their stations, patiently charging in the dark. Dreven sat in his command chair and looked at the empty stars and thought about what she had placed there. And underneath that, quieter, colder, was the question he had been avoiding since he saw the crew members who didn't look afraid. What else does she have? 41 minutes. 38 minutes. Dreven gathered the war room again and told them what Yed had found. The anomalous region, an invisible something, slowly expanding in the space between the fleet and home. The recharge cycle was already nearing completion. The room absorbed it like experienced officers absorb bad information, calmly, quickly, already moving on to the next question before the last one had fully landed. Destroy the ship, Admiral Safe said immediately. Right now, 60 ships at point-blank range. We will turn it into debris before it can fire again. And the first deployment, Brask said. We will deal with the first deployment after we neutralize the source. We don't know what that first deployment is. Then we will find out while it is no longer getting company. Dreven raised his hand. Before we do anything irreversible, he said, I want to understand what we are dealing with. Yed, can you give me anything else on the anomalous region? Yed had been working at her console since the start of the briefing. She looked tired, like a person who had looked at readings that refused to make sense and had stopped expecting them to. I have more data, sir, but not more clarity. She pulled up a display. The region is slowly expanding, but unevenly. It is spreading along the gaps between our ships, following the spaces in our formation. In the room, no one spoke for a moment. It wasn't just expanding outward. Yed said it was permeating them. Dreven looked at the display. The region of warped space had begun as a roughly circular area 200 kilometers in diameter, aimed at a patch of empty space. Now the display showed it differently. Thin, barely measurable threads extended from it, stretching along the negative space between the ships, following the gaps in the fleet's formation like water, finding paths of least resistance through stone. What does this tell you about what it contains? Dreven asked. Whatever is in there, Yed said non-passively, it is orienting itself. Another silence. The specific kind of silence that comes when everyone in the room has the same thought simultaneously and no one wants to say it first. Brask said it. It fired into empty space because it was aiming at us not at our ships, but at the space between them. 29 minutes. Dreven made a decision. He called the Retribution again. This time, Voss answered immediately, which told him she had been watching and waiting for the call. Tell me what you have deployed, he said. I wondered when you would finally ask directly, she said. Her voice was calm, and there was no smile. There was simply no hostility. Instead, there was a simpler, more honest, and somehow more difficult-to-read expression. I will tell you, not because I have to, but because I think you deserve to understand the situation you are in before someone makes it worse. Then tell me what I have deployed. They are called seeds, she said. About 140 of them. They are small, so small that your sensors cannot resolve individual units. They are covered in a material that absorbs rather than reflects your scanning frequencies, so the space reads as distorted, not as objects. They have permeated your formation for the last 20 minutes. She paused. Currently, they are distributed across approximately 60% of your fleet. 28 minutes. Dreven continued to watch the clock on his secondary screen while she spoke. What do they do? He asked. On their own right now? Nothing. They are completely inert. No weapons, no explosives, no active systems. She said it as if reading from a document. Clean, precise, unadorned. Each seed is a positioning unit. It finds a stable position relative to the nearest ship, locks in, and waits. Waits for what? A signal from me. Dreven looked at the display, at the threads of warped space permeating his fleet, at the 60 ships in their arc of waiting around the asterisk of Retribution, and the 240 still at the outer perimeter. The signal makes them do what? He asked. It depends on the signal. She tilted her head. There are different ones. An assessment signal makes them collect targeting data on the ship they are nearest to and transmit it back to this ship. A jamming signal makes them generate a localized electromagnetic pulse that will disable unshielded electronics on nearby ships for about 4-9 minutes. A terminal signal. She stopped. I do not want to use the terminal signal. I want to be clear about this. I am not in this room, and I am not looking for a way to kill 300 ships full of people. But you could. She looked at him steadily. The terminal signal makes every seed pierce the hull of the nearest ship at its current position. 140 breach points, distributed across your fleet simultaneously. She paused. I want to say again that I am not looking for that outcome. 25 minutes. Dreven's hands lay on the chair. He was aware of this because he consciously placed them there, because he was not going to clench his fists, and he was not going to stand up, and he was not going to give the asterisk of Retribution or its admiral the pleasure of watching him change his posture. You built this ship, he said, specifically for this scenario. Yes, Voss said. We foresaw that the Council would send a fleet. We foresaw that eventually someone would send a fleet. The Council was the most likely candidate. She seemed to think about how to say the next part. We studied the Council's records on border enforcement for 9 years. 14 declarations, 14 acceptances. The pattern is very clear. You find a level 4 species that is expanding. You send an overwhelming force. You make the math obvious. The species sees the numbers and accepts the terms. She paused. It is a good strategy. It works because the species you deal with always evaluate the math the same way. They count ships. They compare ships. They see they cannot win a ship-to-ship fight, and they retreat. It is rational behavior. She said, We are not always rational. Something in the room changed not physical temperature, but pressure, the feeling of a landed word that had waited a long time to be said. What you didn't account for, Voss said, is that we have spent most of our history fighting each other. We are a species that has been at war in one form or another as long as we have kept records. We fought enemies that were bigger than us, better equipped, better organized. We were outnumbered in wars we won anyway. She leaned forward slightly. We are very good at asymmetric conflict. We are very good at finding the one thing a large force didn't account for and making it matter more than everything else they brought. And what did we not account for? Dreven asked, although he was beginning to know the answer. The space between your ships, she said. You thought about your numbers. You thought about your firepower. You thought about your formation, your approach vectors, and your overall team ratings. You didn't think about the empty space within your formation, because in ship-to-ship combat, that space is tactically insignificant. Ships fight ships. The space between them is just distance. She paused. We thought about that for 4 years. 21 minutes. Dreven looked at the display once more, at the threads of warped space permeating his fleet, at the asterisk of Retribution sitting quietly and patiently inside the ring of 60 warships, at the approaching charge on the console. If we destroy this ship right now, he said, the seeds are already deployed. You said they are waiting for a signal from you. If you are dead, the signal will never come. That is true, she said. So destroying you actually ends the threat. Also true, she met his gaze, if you can do it quickly enough. She caught the caveat, meaning the seeds also had a passive trigger. If this ship stops broadcasting its identification frequency, if it goes silent for any reason, they will perceive it as a terminal event and act without a signal. She stared at him. They were designed precisely so that destroying this ship would not be a clean solution. If you kill us, the seeds will fire anyway. You will lose the fleet either way, and you will also start a war. The clock showed 19 minutes. Dreven leaned back. He thought about Voss asking him how much he knew about human history. He thought about her words, we are not always rational. He thought about the 14 declarations and 14 acceptances, and about what it said about the Council that their strategy worked so consistently that they stopped asking whether it would stop working. They entered a system they thought they understood. One home world, 400 patrol ships, 2 mining stations, soft-bodied creatures sensitive to temperature, in pressurized suits. They didn't ask the right question. They asked if they could fight them. They should have asked if they had prepared for them. "How long?" Dreven said. And Voss looked at him. "Have you been building for this? Specifically for the council?" "Since we found the Grape Corridor," she said. "Since we realized we were not alone and started studying who our neighbors were." She leaned back. "We found the council's border declaration records. All 14. We studied them. We studied your fleet doctrine, your approach patterns, your sensor capabilities, your formation preferences. We built the seeds so they would approach the gaps in your specific formation protocols." She paused. "The Retribution wasn't built to fight a fleet. It was built to fight your fleet." Somewhere in the depths of Dreven's mind, the old instinct, the one that had quietly worked since he stepped on this ship, the one that said, "Ask her what is on the ship," was now saying something else. It was saying, "She is still not telling you everything." "Seeds," Dreven said slowly. "You have 140 on board. You deployed them with one charge, 142-minute charging cycle." He looked at her. "What did the second charging cycle produce?" Voss paused for a moment, but longer than necessary to think of an answer. She already had the answer. She was deciding whether to give it. "The second cycle," she said, "is different. The seeds are a defensive system. They exist to neutralize your fleet's ability to take offensive action against us. The second system is non-defensive. 18 minutes. "What is that?" Dreven asked. "It is what happens if you decide not to retreat," she said. "It is what we built for a scenario where the Council decided that losing 300 ships was an acceptable price for maintaining the precedent of your border declarations." She leaned forward again. "Because we worked through that scenario, we asked ourselves, what if they don't care what happens to the fleet? What if the Council's credibility is more important to them than 300 ships and the people on them?" Dreven said nothing. "We couldn't let that be a viable option for you," she said. "Because if you could withstand the loss of a fleet and still enforce the declaration, our defensive system would not be enough. So we built a second answer." Her voice remained level, factual. "The second discharge deploys a different type of package. Not seeds, but anchors. 20 of them. Each creates a permanent warping of local space-time, similar to what you discovered earlier, but stable, durable." She paused. "The anchors will be positioned along the most used transit corridors of the Council. Your FTL lines not blocking them, but positioning themselves next to them. But an anchor next to a transit point generates enough space-time distortion that anything using that transit point at speed will experience." She chose her words carefully. "Difficulties." The war room was absolutely silent. "How long will the anchors remain?" Dreven asked. "They do not degrade," Voss said. "They are permanent. Permanent. 20 stable space-time distortions, positioned along the Council's transit lines, not blocking them just there. An invisible obstacle on a road they had used for 900 years, something that would take a decade to map, longer to understand, and would cost ships every year until they did." Dreven thought about the gift basket from 11 years ago. He had found them confusing, joyful creatures back then, clumsily poking through the grape corridor with fruit and packaged items and extremely enthusiastic apologies. The same creatures that had spent 11 years doing that. That looked at a 900-year council report and found a specific gap in the armor, a specific empty space between ships, and then quietly, joyfully, and without any obvious malice, built a weapon that fit exactly into that gap. 15 minutes. "What do you want?" Dreven asked. "To keep our sectors," Voss said. "To keep the settlements and research stations and families that are already there. To continue expanding at the rate we were going." She paused. "And for the Council to understand that we are not the Marin Collective. We are not any of your 14 previous meetings. And the sooner everyone understands this, the better the outcome will be for every species represented in your fleet." The clock showed 14 minutes. Dreven looked at the display, at the asterisk of Retribution, at the threads of warped space woven between the ships of his fleet, at the second charge nearing completion. "Give me 10 minutes, Dreven said. "You have 11, Voss said. He cut the channel. 10 minutes was not enough, and it was also more than enough, because the decision had been clear for some time, and 10 minutes was really only the space each person in the room needed to arrive at it from their own side. Safe arrived at it through the numbers. Brask arrived at it through 40-60 years. Pell arrived at it through the law, which in the absence of an explicit prohibition always gave the High Councilor emergency powers to negotiate non-standard terms on the spot. Dreven arrived at it through something simpler. He thought about a species that had spent thousands of years fighting itself, that had developed weapons against itself and used them against itself, and survived all of it. That, when it finally got to the stars, found a galaxy full of big, old, better-armed civilizations, and quietly, patiently, without malice, thought for 11 years. We need to be prepared, not for conquest. Voss's terms were not the terms of a species that wanted to take something. They were the terms of a species that wanted to be left alone and had built exactly enough to guarantee it. The Council's strength had always been the willingness to act. Humanity's strength, it turned out, was the willingness to prepare. He thought about the 14 border declarations and the 14 acceptances, and what they had in common. Every species the Council had ever encountered this way had looked at the fleet and calculated the cost of resistance and decided the cost was too high. That was rational. That was correct. Humanity looked at the fleet and decided to make resistance free. That was something entirely different. We accept the terms, Dreven said with one modification. He opened the channel. Voss was waiting. The clock showed 9 minutes. She had the same expression she had worn for the better part of the last 2 days. That patient, peaceful calm, like something that had finished moving. One modification, he said. The seeds. Both sides agree that they are only a monitoring system, that their presence on Council ships carries no offensive meaning as long as the treaty is in effect, that they are never used to gather intelligence. No activation of assessment signals, no targeting data collected. He looked at her. They activate only in the event of a breach of the treaty. Voss thought about this for 3 seconds. Agreed. One addition from our side, she said. The Council requests an official diplomatic exchange, a human ambassador in the Council halls, a Council representative on Earth. Something changed on Voss's face, the smallest amount. He had spent 2 days watching her face, and he caught it. A brief fractional softening around the eyes, and it was gone. Agreed. We would like that. The treaty document was drawn up in 30 minutes. Legal staff on both sides worked over an open channel, exchanging wording, confirming translations, checking simultaneously against Council laws and Assembly laws. It was the fastest treaty drafting in Council history, which was partly explained by the simplicity of the terms and partly by the fact that 9 minutes significantly concentrated everyone's attention. At 1847 Standard Council time, Dreven signed it on behalf of the Galactic Sovereignty Council. Voss signed it on behalf of the United Earth Assembly. At 1849, the cyclic power change on the asterisk of Retribution ceased. The second discharge was cancelled. The seeds remained inert, invisible, embedded in the gaps of the fleet's formation like silent punctuation at the end of a sentence no one wanted to finish. At 19, Dreven ordered the fleet to begin its retreat. He returned to the asterisk of Retribution one more time before the fleet left. He hadn't planned to. The treaty was signed. The retreat was underway. There were no procedural reasons to return to the human ship. But he went anyway, because there was one question he hadn't asked, and he thought he might not have another chance. Voss met him at the docking ring personally. Only her, without staff. She looked the same as she had for 2 days. Uniform, short hair, flat face. She also looked slightly tired, which hadn't been visible before the first sign of something that wasn't the surface she had been showing him. He wondered about this, whether the patience was sincerely calm or constructed. He was starting to think it was both. One question, he said. She invited him to walk with her. They walked down the corridor past crew stations, past functional walls in the warm yellow light. Ask, she said. Your crew, he said. When we boarded, when the fleet was closing in around you, when the advance began. He looked at her. They weren't afraid. I have seen species encounter the Council fleet. I know what fear looks like. Your crew didn't look like that. He paused. Why? Voss walked beside him, not answering immediately. They passed a young crew member, one of those Dreven had noticed on his first visit, sitting at a navigation station. The young man looked up, saw the High Councilor, and gave the same light nod as before. Relaxed, present, unafraid. How much do you know about how we smile? Voss asked. Dreven looked at her. It is an expression of positive emotion, but also what we do when we are afraid, she said. It is what we do in high-stress situations to signal to each other that we are still functioning, that we haven't collapsed. It is partly performance, partly sincerity, and the line between those two things is thinner than you think. She glanced at him from the side. My crew was afraid. Most of them, not all, but most. Dreven thought about the crew members who had nodded. The young officer at the navigation station, the easy posture, the absence of visible fear. Then why did they look like that? He asked. Because they trained for it, she said. Specifically for it. For 2 years before this deployment, they ran simulations of exactly this scenario. Council fleet on the outer perimeter, 60 ships in an arc of waiting, seeds deployed, charges accumulating, the clock ticking. She paused. They failed those simulations many times, made mistakes, lost the ship on paper a dozen times. And then they succeeded, again and again, until success became normal for them. She stopped. When you train for something until you know every outcome, every variable, every decision point, you are still afraid when it happens. You are a biological being, and your body does what bodies do. But the fear is familiar. You recognize it. And somewhere, underneath the fear, there is a more stable thing, because you have been here before. She paused again. Not exactly here, but here in every meaningful aspect. Dreven looked at her. Preparation, he said. Preparation, Voss said. He thought about this, about the species that had built this ship and trained this crew and drafted these terms, and done all of this before the council had even set a meeting, before the fleet had even assembled. How many people on Earth know about the ship's existence? He asked. Most of them, she said. We don't keep secrets. Well, someone will always talk. There was a small warmth in her voice that hadn't been there before. People know that we built it. They know what it does. When the fleet appeared on our long-range sensors, the news was everywhere. Billions of people were watching. She glanced at the hull plate on the wall they were passing. They weren't afraid either. Mostly not. They were watching to see if it would work. And if it hadn't worked, she paused. Then we would have built the next one differently. She said it without bravado. It wasn't even confidence in the ordinary sense. It was something flatter and more persistent than confidence. Something that didn't require an audience or a guarantee. A species that had been knocked down so many times that being knocked down ceased to be a relevant variable. The relevant variable was whether you got back up and what you built next. Dreven returned to the shuttle. He stood at the docking ring for a moment before crossing and looked back one last time. Voss stood at the end of the corridor, watching him go. High Councilor, she said, as much as possible, we didn't want this to go badly. We prepared for it to go badly because that is how it is done. But we didn't want it. He looked at her. What did you want? Neighbors, she said. We have a whole galaxy, and we were alone in our corner for a very long time. The tiredness became more noticeable, and underneath it was something else. Something sincere and simple that didn't fit in the same room as the seeds, the transit anchors, and the 4 2-minute charging cycles. We just wanted it to be done correctly. He nodded once. He crossed the docking ring and closed the hatch behind him. The fleet retreated in perfect order. 6 hours, as specified in the treaty, 300 ships retreating from the edge of human space in a slow, purposeful movement like an outgoing tide. The asterisk of eternal witness was last, by custom. The flagship always left last. Dreven stood on the bridge and watched the asterisk of Retribution on the display screen as the distance increased. One ship, 400 meters, dark gray hull in the darkness of space, already small against the background, shrinking. Sir, Yed said from her station. The seeds, I know, he said. They were still there. He could feel them, but not with sensors. It was an awareness of something you could not see or measure but could not know. 140 little quiet things distributed across the gaps of the fleet's formation, inert, patient, heading home with them like a reminder written in a language with one word. Remember. Not a threat. She had been clear about that. Not a weapon in the ordinary sense, but something more precise than a weapon. A record. An insurance policy. A small permanent presence in the space between his ships that said, "We were here, and we are not going anywhere." And that too. He thought about what the council halls would say when he returned, about the special session that would be required, about the 29 votes that were cast on the assumption that this would be the 15th. And this was the first of something else entirely. He thought about the new seat in the council halls, about a human ambassador entering those carved bone walls for the first time, into a room designed to make visitors feel insignificant. And he wondered, will that ambassador feel small? He suspected not. He looked at the display for the last time. The Retribution was barely visible now. A small, dark figure against the starry sky, shrinking as the distance between them increased. He thought about thousands of years of war, about a species that had inflicted every possible damage on itself and survived all of it. About someone who, upon reaching the stars, found a galaxy full of big, old, better-armed civilizations and quietly, patiently, without malice, thought for 11 years. We need to be prepared, not for conquest. Her terms were not the terms of a species that wanted to take something. They were the terms of a species that wanted to be left alone and had built exactly enough to guarantee it. The Council's strength had always been the willingness to act. Humanity's strength, it turned out, was the willingness to prepare. He thought about the 14 border declarations and the 14 acceptances and what they had in common. Every species the Council had ever encountered this way had looked at the fleet and calculated the cost of resistance and decided the cost was too high. That was rational. That was correct. Humanity looked at the fleet and decided to make resistance free. That was something entirely different. "Course set for Council space," the navigation officer said. "Proceed," Dreven said. The Eternal Witness turned and accelerated. The Retribution vanished from the display. Human space was left behind. The stars ahead were the same stars as always, older than everyone in this fleet, indifferent to the question of who was big and who was small, who sent 300 ships and who sent one. But the space between those stars was now different. 140 things in it that weren't there before. And somewhere on a blue and white planet 11 light minutes behind, billions of people who had been watching their screens learned that the math had worked, that the preparation had worked, that one ship had been enough, and they smiled not because they had won, but because they had been ready. There was a difference. It had taken 900 years and 14 declarations, and one very patient admiral with a cup of coffee and a piece of Kret radar hull plate on the wall to make the distinction. But now it was clear. And somewhere in the gaps of the Council's finest fleets, 140 little quiet things were heading home with them, and waiting, and remembering.